rent to rent, there's probably sort of three types of rent to rent. There's sort of ordinary, disclosed, perfectly reasonable rent to rent, where someone says perfectly openly and appropriately, I want to rent your property and let it out, and they're competent, they do a good job, which I'm fairly unconcerned about. There are several good businesses in that area at the moment. The second type I sort of class as stupid people rent to rent, which is where someone thinks they know what they're talking about. They may have been on a course or read something on the internet and says to somebody, I'll rent your property and sublet it, but they do it badly. The agreement that they've got with the main landlord is badly drafted, or it's just an AST with bits crossed out, where it's completely inappropriate. They don't know anything about things like licensing, and they end up leading the landlord into a very messy situation. And then usually when they get exposed, they just develop ostrich syndrome and hide from the whole thing. The third type, which is what deeply concerns me, is what you might choose to call fraudulent rent to rent, where people come to landlords and say, I'm going to rent your house off you for myself and my family, and before the landlord knows it, there's in fact all kinds of other random people in. Now there are some grey areas. Sometimes stupid rent to rent is also somewhat fraudulent in that the person is actually quite well aware that the property should have a licence, or they're lying to people about who owns it, or they're not paying the money over, or they don't protect deposits properly, all kinds of other sort of side issues. So that there's a bit of crossover between those, but it's those sort of two areas that I think are of great concern. Well, I think the first thing to say is that if it looks like it's too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true, which is a sort of a common point about all kinds of fraud and scam. Rent to rent works effectively by rent arbitrage. Basically, it only works because the price per room for rents is higher than the price for a property. But if someone is coming to you saying, I'm going to rent your property out and sublet it, and I will guarantee that you will get this much per month, then you need to think about how they're going to guarantee that. If they say they're going to guarantee it by renting out the whole property to a single family, and they're offering you near on the market rent, that can't possibly be true. Otherwise, they're going to be making that single family pay way more than the market rent, which is unlikely and unsustainable. So clearly they're likely to be renting on a room-by-room basis. If that's the case, you need to think about whether they're going to use the property as an HMO, which they probably are, and whether that's going to bring you in the way of licensing your particular area, which it probably is if it's a relatively large property, and more so, of course, as HMO licensing gets tightened. As a landlord, you will be liable for the license. Even if they tell you they're going to get one, even if you don't know anything about it, you're still liable for the situation. So that's a matter of great concern. You also need to think about what type of tenancies or sublets they're going to offer. Most of these people purport to offer licenses for the rooms. They're probably not licenses, they're probably ASTs. That means that the deposits need to be protected. If that's not done, you're potentially at risk of claims against you as the superior landlord. It also means that even if you get rid of this person at some point, you will inherit the subtenants and they will become your direct tenants, and you will then have to resolve them yourself. And in practice, you should always bear in mind that if you get rid of the intermediate person, you may well inherit back a house with unexpected random people in it who you have to deal with. So I think the most important things to think about are, does the deal actually make sense? Is it upfront? Is it transparent? Is it on the table? Of course the person's going to be making a profit, that's fine, but it's worth being clear with them, saying, look, I don't mind you making a profit, but I need to understand how you're doing it. Is it going to be compliant with all the relevant legislation, and particularly licensing restrictions? And I think it's very much worth demanding to see the sub-agreements that are going to be on the table, so or making sure they're restricted to particular types, and you need to know the names. And you need to see copies of those completed agreements, and you really need a provision in there that's going to make sure that you're regularly updated with who's in your property, what rent they're paying, and make sure you have copies of the agreements. Because in the future, you may need to actually remove those people yourself if things fall apart. Right, well the first and most important thing is that if you've got an intermediate tenant who's not paying you rent, they're not an AST tenant, you don't need to wait for 2 months. If they're in arrears by a day, you should be on the phone. Do not be fobbed off. They've collected the money off the tenants, they have undertaken to pay it to you. So you shouldn't be fobbed off by subtenants not paying, cash flow or anything else. You need to know where the money is. If they're saying they've paid for repairs, then you want to see the receipts. I would always act promptly and surely in those situations. So in fact, the reason people tend to have problems is that they allow a situation to deteriorate If you're clear, prompt, and explicit about what you want, then those people have much less scope, and they will either pay you but then try and get out of the deal, and best to let them go probably, or they will immediately run away, and it's pretty obvious where you're going to end up. The reality is that all rent-to-rent deals potentially, and actually quite frequently in my experience, unless they're with very reputable companies, end up with landlords having to take possession proceedings against somebody. So if you want to have an asset that you don't want to manage, that's always got a risk associated with it, and property may not be the best way of having an asset that you don't want to manage. There are much simpler, more hands-off investments, and rent-to-rent is actually potentially quite a hands-on investment. You need to be aware of that fact.